The beginning of spiritual awakening. Imagine a silent moment when, without warning, the life you always considered normal begins to fall apart before your eyes. It is not a tragedy, it is not a mourning, it is not a dramatic breakup. It is something more subtle and at the same time more overwhelming. You realize that you can no longer believe in the roles you have been playing, the masks you have worn for years, that of the exemplary worker, the obedient child, the always available friend, the human being constantly trying to fit in, suddenly feels suffocating, like an old, heavy, and overly tight garment, no longer fitting the size of your soul. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who dedicated his life to understanding the labyrinths of the psyche, called this process individuation. For him, true awakening does not happen like a sudden lightning bolt that illuminates the dark night of the soul. It occurs slowly, almost imperceptibly, like an underground stream that gradually finds its passage. Jung said that it is not the ordinary consciousness that awakens overnight, but the self, the authentic core of being, which emerges as the ego begins to dissolve. In Hermeticism, this dissolution of the ego is compared to the stage of nigredo in spiritual alchemy, the moment when old structures rot so that a new form of life can emerge. Symbolic death is necessary. Lead must decompose before it transmutes into gold. Thus, spiritual awakening is inevitably a process of loss, but it is not loss in the common sense of the word. It is rather a liberation from the illusions that kept you imprisoned. Modern science, especially through neuroscience and psychology, is already beginning to confirm this phenomenon. Studies on brain plasticity show that when we go through profound processes of existential questioning, areas linked to social attachment and the need for approval begin to reorganize. The brain literally reshapes itself when we stop living in function of external expectations. In other words, spiritual awakening is not just a metaphor. It is a concrete reprogramming of the mind and body. And here begins the great journey. Jung observed that spiritually awakened people do not become superhuman. On the contrary, they become more human than ever. Awakening is not about achieving untouchable perfection, but about letting go of everything that was false. And in this process, 7 fundamental things end up being slowly abandoned. Not because we rationally decide to leave them, but because, like a skin that no longer fits us, they simply fall away. These 7 renunciations are like doors closing one by one. At first, you try to go back, try to revive old patterns, try to fit once more into the character that once seemed comfortable. But something inside you resists. It is as if your very body, your psyche, and your soul begin to reject what is no longer in tune. It is an inevitable, painful, but also deeply liberating process. In Hermeticism, this is called the law of correspondence. As above, so below, as within, so without. What you abandon internally begins to reflect in the external world. Relationships change, habits dissolve, priorities are transformed, and often this generates chaos. That is why so many confuse awakening with depression or an existential crisis. But in truth, it is not the end. It is the beginning. It is the dark night that precedes the dawn. Now you may be asking yourself, if this process is inevitable, how do I know when it has begun? The answer lies in the feeling of incompatibility with the old life. Trivial conversations sound empty. Social games seem ridiculous. Ambitions that once moved you now bore you. You can no longer force yourself to believe in what does not resonate. It is like trying to feed on something your body can no longer tolerate. Awakening is this, a growing intolerance to inauthenticity. And this is where Jung, Hermeticism, and science meet. They agree that awakening is not about adding new layers, but about removing what is not essential. It is not about becoming someone new, but about freeing yourself from who you never truly were. The gold was always hidden within the lead. The light was always concealed beneath the shadows. The process is only one of revelation. In the next sections, we will explore each of these 7 things we inevitably abandon on the spiritual path. Get ready, because it is not a smooth or comfortable journey, but it is the only path that leads from the prison of the persona to the freedom of the self. The first renunciation, the search for approval. The first and most subtle prison that breaks in the process of spiritual awakening is the desperate need for approval. For years, perhaps decades, we live as actors on an invisible stage, shaping every word, every gesture, and even our most intimate thoughts to please audiences that, most of the time, are not even paying attention. We seek compliments, likes, smiles of approval, promotions at work, the proud look of family, the validation of friends. And for a while, this mechanism seems to give us security. After all, being accepted is a survival instinct. It is part of human DNA. But something changes when the spirit awakens. What once was pleasurable or even addictive begins to cause an almost physical discomfort. Jung described this phenomenon as a kind of allergy to inauthenticity. Just like someone who has always consumed sugar and suddenly develops intolerance, the awakened soul automatically rejects the search for approval. It is not a rational decision, it is a visceral reaction. From the Hermetic perspective, this is the moment when the principle of polarity manifests itself. Everything that once vibrated in harmony with the ego, the need to be loved, to be noticed, to be praised, begins to vibrate in dissonance with the self. What once nourished now poisons. It is as if the soul had found its underground water source and no longer depended on the unstable rain of others' opinions. Science is also beginning to observe this movement. Research in social psychology shows that extreme dependence on external validation is directly linked to cases of anxiety and depression. When someone awakens spiritually, the brain circuits associated with social reward begin to deactivate. It is as if the brain were reprogramming the way it experiences pleasure, shifting the focus from external approval to the feeling of inner integrity. This, however, does not happen all at once. Jung observed that there is a slow progression. First, you lose interest in the approval of strangers, then of co-workers, then of friends, and lastly, and in the most painful way, of your own family. Each layer abandoned is like tearing out deep roots. You feel both relief and pain, because deep down you are not just abandoning a behavior, but an entire identity built around the gaze of the other. Real stories from Jung's patients illustrate this process. A woman who lived for her mother's approval began to feel nausea every time she tried to please her. A man obsessed with professional recognition completely lost interest in promotions. They were not rebellious, they were in transformation. It is as if the psyche itself had pulled the emergency brake. No matter how hard you try, you can no longer twist yourself to fit external expectations. This transition creates a strange period, almost schizophrenic, between two worlds. You stop posting to gain likes but still miss them. You no longer seek compliments but notice their absence. You don't care about others' opinions but still hear the echo of silence. It is like being in withdrawal from an addiction, and in a way, you are. Dependence on approval is a socially accepted addiction. Awakening is your detox. In Hermeticism, this process is compared to the transmutation of lead into gold. Lead is heavy, dense, incapable of shining by itself. It needs the external gaze to have value. Gold, however, shines on its own, regardless of who observes it. When you abandon the need for approval, you don't become indifferent to others, but free. You discover inner authority, what Jung described as a silent compass that points to your true north, regardless of external opinions. And it is at this point that the journey gains unexpected beauty. When the hunger for approval dies, an unshakable sense of inner worth is born. It is not self-confidence, which still depends on comparison, but self-existence. It is the silent certainty that you are enough simply by being. That is why spiritually awakened people seem to carry a mysterious confidence. It is not that they are trying to be confident. They have simply abandoned the exhausting game of earning the right to exist through others' approval. Of course, this does not happen without resistance. The ego, accustomed to surviving on applause, will try to sabotage the process. It will whisper, "If you don't please, you'll be alone. If you don't seek approval, you'll be rejected." And for a time, you may even believe it. But the self, your essence, remains firm, refusing to go back. This internal struggle is painful, but necessary. It is the first great test of awakening. In the end, abandoning the search for approval is like crossing a narrow and unstable bridge. You look back and see the world of masks you left behind. You look forward and still cannot fully see what will come. But step by step, you free yourself from the slavery of needing to be seen to feel you exist. You finally find within yourself the validation you always sought in others. The second and third renunciations, being special and the performance of happiness. If the first renunciation is the pursuit of approval, the second is even more intriguing, the need to be special. It may seem contradictory, doesn't it? After all, when we talk about spirituality, we imagine beings who are unique, different, enlightened. But Jung observed that, at the beginning of awakening, many people go through what he called spiritual inflation, a state in which the discovery of new truths generates a sense of superiority. It is as if the person had found a secret that distinguishes them from the rest of sleeping humanity. This phase is almost inevitable. Upon perceiving hidden dimensions of life, You feel that you know something others don't know. This can manifest in subtle forms of differentiation, discreetly mentioning your meditation practice, your symbolic dreams, your mystical synchronicities, or even using sophisticated language to show that you have transcended the unconscious mass. It is the spiritualized ego, the old desire to stand out, now dressed in new clothes. But something happens over time. The weight of this need begins to suffocate. What once seemed like wings now turns into chains. Jung reported cases of patients who lived to be recognized as the wise ones, the conscious ones, the most awakened, until one day they simply could no longer sustain this performance. The pursuit of exceptionality revealed itself as just another prison. In Hermeticism, this process is seen as the dissolution of the illusion of I am more. True individuation is not about becoming special, but about becoming authentic. When we stop wanting to be extraordinary, paradoxically, our true uniqueness begins to emerge naturally. Not performative, not inflated, but genuine. It is like a flower that blooms not to be admired, but because it is in its nature to bloom. Science corroborates this. Research on self-esteem shows that individuals who build their identity around social differentiation suffer more from anxiety and loneliness. On the other hand, those who develop what psychologists call radical self-acceptance experience higher levels of well-being. In other words, the less you need to be special, the more at peace you feel. The third renunciation is perhaps one of the most shocking, the performance of happiness. We live in a culture that idolizes the constant smile, positive thinking, and the image that being well is synonymous with being evolved. In the spiritual world, this is even more evident. Motivational quotes, daily affirmations, the idea of being above negative emotions. But Jung was categorical. True awakening does not make us eternally happy, but deeply real. This means abandoning the mask of forced happiness. No longer pretending everything is fine when it is not, allowing yourself to cry, to feel anger, to admit vulnerability. This process is painful because the ego fears that by showing fragility, it will lose respect or love. But the awakened soul understands that it is only possible to truly love and be loved when you show yourself whole, with both light and shadow. In Hermeticism, this stage corresponds to the principle of integrated duality, the recognition that light and shadow are not enemies, but complementary parts of the same reality. There is no dawn without night, no alchemical gold without the initial putrefaction. To be real is to accept the full spectrum of the human experience. Modern science, especially second-generation positive psychology, also confirms this. Research shows that people who accept their negative emotions and do not try to repress them develop greater resilience, emotional balance, and even better physical health. Pretending to be happy, on the other hand, increases the risk of emotional burnout and depression. Abandoning the performance of happiness is like breaking a mirror that has always reflected an artificial version of you. At first, there is a void. Who am I without this smiling mask? But little by little you realize that you don't need to be happy all the time to be true. And in this authenticity, a genuine, spontaneous joy arises, one that does not depend on pretense. These two renunciations, the need to be special and the performance of happiness, are deeply connected. Both are strategies of the ego to guarantee survival, to be seen as unique and to be seen as positive. When you let them go, something greater begins to be born, the freedom to simply be. And before we move on to the next renunciation, I want to propose a symbolic gesture. If this message has already resonated with you, write the word rebirth here in the comments. This act, as simple as it may seem, works like an energetic seal. It is as if you are telling the universe, I am ready to let die what no longer serves me and allow the new to blossom within me. By writing, you not only interact, but also send both an internal and external signal of commitment to your own awakening. And stay with me until the end, because each stage of this journey connects. And at the last point you will understand how all these renunciations form a unique path to true transformation. The fourth renunciation, the need for certainty. Perhaps one of the most painful renunciations of spiritual awakening is letting go of certainty. For most of our lives, we feel safe believing that we know who we are, what truth is, how the world works, and even what happens after death. These certainties function like psychological crutches, providing stability to an ego that fears impermanence. But Jung observed that as the soul awakens, these convictions begin to collapse. Not because they were necessarily wrong, but because the very need to cling to them becomes unbearable. Imagine a brilliant physicist who, after a profound awakening, confessed to Jung, I used to believe that I understood how the universe worked. Now I realize I don't even know how my cup of coffee really exists. This confession is not a sign of ignorance, but of clarity. It is the realization that mystery is greater than any mental model. The more awareness, the less need to fix rigid truths. In Hermeticism, this is what we call the veil of mystery. The Hermetic axiom, "the all is unknowable," reminds us that the human mind will never be able to encompass the totality of reality. The obsessive search for certainties is, in fact, a form of spiritual and intellectual arrogance. The true mage, the true seeker, learns to inhabit paradox, to act without guarantees, to trust without possessing explanations, to move in the dark with the serenity of someone who knows that mystery itself is sacred. And here modern science comes into play. Quantum physics, for example, revealed that at the most fundamental level of matter, there are no fixed certainties, only probabilities. The electron has no defined position until it is observed. It is a field of possibilities. This discovery shook centuries of scientific certainty and opened space for a new understanding. Reality is not a rigid mechanism, but a mystery in constant flux. Abandoning the need for certainty does not mean falling into relativism or giving up the search for truth. It means accepting that truth is too alive to fit into closed concepts. It is like trying to imprison the wind in a box. The moment you capture it, it ceases to be wind. The same happens with truth. Spiritual awakening teaches us to live with open questions, to exchange "I know" for "I am in relation with mystery." But this renunciation is terrifying for the ego. After all, the ego builds itself on solid narratives. I am this. I believe in that. I know how things work. When these narratives collapse, the ego feels as if it is dying, and in a sense, it is. It is the death of identity fixed in certainties. It is the death of the arrogance of possessing truth. Jung observed that this process happens in stages. First, you lose certainty about the external world. What you thought you understood about politics, religion, science begins to feel simplistic. Then you lose certainty about others. You realize you cannot truly predict their intentions or control their behaviors. Next, you lose certainty about yourself. You discover that your identity is more fluid than you imagined. And finally, you even abandon certainty about your essence, entering what mystics call the cloud of unknowing. In Hermeticism, this experience corresponds to the principle of paradoxicality. The initiate learns to sustain contradictions without needing to resolve them. They can believe and doubt at the same time. They can act with conviction without demanding guarantees. They can love without possessing, trust without proof, live without fully understanding. This ability to embrace paradoxes is a sign of spiritual maturity. The science of the mind also confirms this. Studies in cognitive psychology show that people with greater tolerance for ambiguity have higher levels of creativity, resilience, and emotional flexibility. In other words, letting go of the need for certainty does not leave us lost, but more adaptable and free. This renunciation, however, is slow. You do not wake up overnight accepting mystery. First, you struggle. You try to rebuild spiritual certainties in place of the old material certainties. It is the famous dogma swap, abandoning rigid religions only to adopt equally rigid esoteric explanations. But little by little, even those certainties dissolve, until only silence remains, the not knowing, and paradoxically, within that emptiness, a new form of wisdom is born. At this point, many feel they have lost everything: identity, beliefs, references. But Jung reminded us that this is the most fertile moment of the process, because when the mind releases the obsession with certainties, the heart finally opens to the direct experience of life. You no longer need to explain the sunset to be moved by it. You no longer need to understand love to feel its force. You no longer need to decipher the universe to live its greatness. Abandoning the need for certainty is like stepping into an unknown ocean without a map or compass. The ego screams, desperate for solid ground, but the self silently whispers, "Trust, you have never been lost." The fifth and sixth renunciations, guilt and spiritual bypassing. If up to this point the process of awakening has already seemed challenging, the fifth renunciation raises the bar even higher, abandoning guilt. This may be one of the most difficult renunciations, because guilt functions like a psychic glue that keeps us attached to our stories of pain. We blame our parents for not giving us the love we deserved. We blame partners for their betrayals. We blame society for its injustices. We blame ourselves for our failures. Guilt, as toxic as it is, gives us a strange sense of identity. I am this way because I was hurt. Jung observed that abandoning guilt does not mean denying what happened or excusing unacceptable behaviors. It means reclaiming the power we surrendered when we fixed ourselves in the role of the victim. As long as we blame, we remain trapped in the past. When we release, we open space to create a new narrative. This is not easy. A woman who was accompanied by Jung and who had suffered severe abuse took years to go through this process. At first, the anger was legitimate. The blame seemed fair. But little by little, she realized that clinging to guilt kept her tied to the trauma. The day she managed to let go was not the day she forgot or justified, but the day she finally chose not to let that story define her life anymore. From the Hermetic point of view, this renunciation corresponds to the stage of inner alchemy known as rubedo, the final integration when suffering is not erased, but transformed into power. It is the fire that, instead of destroying, transmutes. When we abandon guilt, we recognize that each pain was also a disguised teacher, an experience that, however cruel it may seem, served to reveal hidden strengths within us. Science also offers powerful insights here. Research in trauma psychology shows that people who manage to reinterpret their painful experiences through what we call post-traumatic growth present more resilience and a greater sense of purpose. In other words, it is not about denying suffering, but metabolizing it into wisdom. This liberation, however, comes with an excruciating stage, assuming radical responsibility. It means recognizing how, on some unconscious level, we repeated patterns, attracted people and situations that mirrored our wounds. This perception is painful because it forces us to abandon the comfortable narrative of, "I had nothing to do with it." But it is precisely here that freedom is born. When we stop blaming, we also stop handing over our power. The sixth renunciation is intimately linked to this one, spiritual bypassing. It is about using spiritual concepts and practices as an escape from human experience. It is when someone meditates for hours a day, not to connect, but to avoid feeling the pain of a loss. It is when we repeat phrases like, "everything happens for a reason," to avoid facing our anger or sadness. It is when we use the idea of "we are all one" to justify the absence of healthy boundaries. Jung often saw this, people who had turned spirituality into a kind of armor against life. He knew that at some point, the process of awakening requires letting go of that armor, because as brilliant as it may seem, it is still a mask. True spiritual maturation is not about transcending the human experience, but about embodying it fully. In Hermeticism, this movement is explained by the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. There is no point in seeking heaven if you cannot inhabit earth. There is no point in wanting to touch the infinite if you reject your finitude. The true mage does not flee from life, but embraces it in its totality, conscious that the divine manifests itself even in human imperfections. Science confirms this necessity as well. Studies in clinical psychology show that people who practice spirituality as an escape tend to present higher levels of dissociation and emotional difficulties. On the other hand, those who integrate spiritual practices with full acceptance of their emotions develop more balance, mental health, and the ability to deal with adversities. Abandoning spiritual bypassing is many times more painful than the initial awakening, because it requires us to return to the body, to raw emotions, to the wounds we tried to sublimate with mantras and meditations. It is like descending from the sacred mountain to once again inhabit the human village with all its confusion, imperfection, and beauty. One Buddhist patient of Jung described it in a touching way. "I spent 20 years trying not to be anyone, transcending myself. Now I am learning to be someone with this life, these pains, and these gifts." This phrase captures the essence of the sixth renunciation, understanding that spirituality is not about escaping the human, but consciously embodying it. These two renunciations, abandoning guilt and letting go of spiritual bypassing, mark a profound turning point in the process of awakening. The first gives back the power we had handed over to the past. The second gives back the humanity we had tried to deny. Together, they prepare us for the last and perhaps most transformative renunciation, letting go of the isolation of awakening and returning to authentic connection with others. The seventh renunciation, spiritual isolation. After crossing the detachment from approval, the need to be special, the performance of happiness, the search for certainty, guilt, and spiritual deviation, there remains one last barrier: spiritual isolation. This is perhaps the most paradoxical of all, because at the beginning of awakening, many people believe that loneliness is the price of consciousness. It's natural. When you perceive illusions that most still don't see, you feel displaced. Casual conversations seem superficial, social gatherings sound forced, old relationships lose their shine, a sense of walking alone on an invisible road arises. Many even take on this loneliness as a kind of spiritual merit. I'm alone because I've awakened more than others. But Jung warned, this is just another subtle trick of the ego. True spiritual maturity does not lead to isolation, but to a new form of connection. Not the unconscious fusion of the past, but the conscious meeting of the present. Jung called this conscious relationship, being with others without losing yourself, loving without attachment, sharing without preaching, being intimate without dissolving. In Hermeticism, this renunciation is connected to the principle of unity, not the illusory unity of dependency, but the conscious unity which recognizes both separation and connection. Just as the universe is made up of billions of unique stars that together form a single galaxy, we too are called to shine individually without denying our interdependence. Science also confirms the importance of this stage. Research in social neuroscience shows that authentic connection is vital for mental and physical health. Prolonged isolation increases the risk of diseases, while genuine bonds strengthen the immune system and prolong life. This means that even spiritually, we are not born for absolute solitude. Awakening may temporarily distance us, but its ultimate destiny is to reconnect us on another level. Abandoning spiritual isolation does not mean returning to unconscious blending, but learning to be present among people without losing integrity. It means accepting that, no matter how awake you are, you still share the same humanity as everyone. And it is precisely at this point of humility that true compassion is born. Recognizing in each person a reflection of your own journey, we have reached the end of this journey through the 7 renunciations of spiritual awakening. And here is the great truth that Jung, Hermeticism, and even science teach us. Everything you release is not a loss, but a liberation. By letting go of approval, inner authority is born. By releasing the need to be special, authenticity blossoms. By abandoning the performance of happiness, real joy emerges. By surrendering certainty, you discover the wisdom of mystery. By letting go of guilt, you reclaim your power. By releasing spiritual deviation, you integrate your humanity. And by letting go of isolation, you find true connection. This process doesn't happen in days or weeks. It's a slow dance, often lasting years or even decades. You will let go and grab again. You will move forward and step back. But don't be deceived. Every time you release, even if only for a moment, something in you is reborn freer. Spiritual awakening is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming real. It's not about accumulating more masks, but about letting them fall. It's not about conquering something external, but about revealing what has always been inside. Each renunciation is, in fact, a reconciliation with who you truly are. If you've made it this far, it's because your soul is already on this path. Perhaps you're feeling the pain of losing old certainties. Perhaps you're living the discomfort of no longer fitting in. But remember, this is not the end, it's the beginning. What is dying in you was never truly you. What is being born is your true self. Trust the process, no matter how chaotic it may seem. And more, write again in the comments the words, expansion of consciousness, not only to reinforce your commitment to your own journey, but to inspire others who read it. Every comment is a spark that can light the flame in someone who also needs this message. Thank you for watching this video. We ask that you subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, activate the notification bell to be notified about our posts. Until the next video.